One of the worst things a soybean farmer can get is late season diseases like sudden death syndrome in soybeans or brown stem rot.
Well, just when you think you've made it, you think the yield is there,
Yep.
then all of a sudden, boom, you get a surprise. You get some leaves that don't look quite right in the field. Pretty soon you see, wow, that's kind of a big area out there. And there goes some yield, and what a disappointment at the end of the year after you've already spent all your money on the farm, done all the management all year long. So what we want to talk about is if you've got some diseases that start popping up in your fields, first of all, identifying which diseases you have and then dealing with them for the next year so you don't have those problems pop up again. Now there are two of them that are real common that we're going to talk about today that are often misdiagnosed as the other one. It's brown stem rot and sudden death syndrome. If you've had either of these diseases, you may have had an agronomist or another farmer come out and look at your field and say, wow, you've got sudden death syndrome, when really it's brown stem rot. Or he says, you've got brown stem rot, and no, it's actually sudden death syndrome. And there are some big differences, and it is really easy to tell the two apart when you know what you're looking for.
Okay, let's talk about the main difference, and that is in the stem, in the pith. With sudden death syndrome, you're going to find a white pith, and with brown stem rot, you're going to see a brown pith. So what you want to do is slice open each stem and look for that difference inside. But in terms of externally, the leaves are going to look about the same with either disease.
Yeah, the leaf symptoms look very similar, and that's why many guys will confuse one for the other. They don't do that extra step of just slicing open that stem to see if it's brown inside. Well, that's pretty easy. It's brown stem rot. That's a pretty well-named disease. And if you've got sudden death syndrome, you're going to see white inside that pith. So that's the big difference there.
Okay, now both of these are caused by fungus. And when we talk about fungicide, the purpose of a fungicide is to kill fungus, but fungicide later on in the season probably isn't going to do you a lot of good for controlling these two diseases.
Well, you're spraying for foliar leaf diseases, and we're talking about diseases that are actually inside that plant. You can't really do much on them when you're spraying those foliar products. So what you have to do is start right from the beginning. Let's start with brown stem rot. We used to always think of brown stem rot as a bean on bean or a continuous soybean disease because that fungus is going to overwinter in your residue. So what we used to do on the farm when Dad would have to put beans on the same ground where he had beans the year before, so he'd say, well, I got to get out and do some tillage because otherwise I'm going to have disease problems and it's going to be brown stem rot.
And
so
the other thing is he'd look for resistant varieties or varieties more tolerant.
Well, there are resistant varieties for brown stem rot. Here's another difference. There aren't really sudden death syndrome resistant varieties. There's different levels of tolerance for sudden death syndrome. Now, with brown stem rot, one of the things that you want to keep in mind is if everything else in your field is perfect, your chances of having brown stem rot are pretty low.
Yeah, but it's that way with any disease, any problem you have on the farm. If you've only got that one problem, it usually is not that bad, unless of course the problem is hail.
Well, yes, but like brown stem rot, for example, we see a real correlation with soil pH. Where we've got pHs that are below 6.5, we tend to have more issues, especially when fertility is low. So if you've got low fertility and low pH, we tend to see more brown stem rot. Now, it can happen when pHs get higher as well, but if your pH is right about neutral and your fertility is right, it's pretty rare for us to see brown stem rot in those fields.
Well, another thing is nematodes. If you have cyst nematodes, you could have more of both of these diseases because, again, it's just another additive factor and your plant is already weakened from the soybean cyst nematode.
Well, it's kind of interesting because researchers have actually found sudden death syndrome in the cysts. So I don't know if the cysts are actually, the soybean cyst nematodes are actually carrying that disease into the plant, but they're certainly opening up wounds in the root system for sudden death syndrome to get into the plant. So that's a really big deal too.
So we've got a lot of management strategies for you. Have good overall nutrition in your crops, have good fertility, get the right soil pH. You want to do a good job in terms of picking varieties on the farm. Use crop rotation. If you only planted soybeans one every 3 years, for example, you would be less likely to have these problems than if you planted soybeans one every 2 years. There are just a number of things that you can do overall on the farm to prevent these problems from happening. And one other thing we haven't mentioned yet is treated seed. Is treated seed going to help you much?
Well, absolutely. If you're treating that seed with good fungicides at planting time, you're a lot less likely to have disease problems because you're going to protect the roots when they're in cool, wet soils, and that's when a lot of these diseases get started.
Well, once again, it's probably too late on your farm this year to do much about sudden death syndrome or brown stem rot other than identify if you actually have one of those problems and manage it a little bit better going down the road.
When you're out in the fields looking for disease issues, don't forget to be on the lookout for weeds like our Weed of the Week. We'll show you how to get this one under control coming up next.